Picture this. Darkness falls across a landscape so cold that your breath doesn't just fog, it crystallizes midair, forming tiny ice needles that drift downward like frozen stars. The temperature has plummeted to 50 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The wind screams across the tundra with a voice that sounds almost alive, almost hungry. And the night ahead stretches not for 8 or 10 hours, but for something closer to 18, maybe 20 hours of absolute bone-deep darkness. This isn't a nightmare. This is Tuesday night, 30,000 years ago, somewhere on the Eurasian steppe. And somehow, impossibly, humans not only survived these conditions, they thrived in them. They raised children. They created art. They told stories. They laughed, loved, and built communities that would eventually spread across the entire planet. Tonight, we're going to walk through those endless nights together. Not the sanitized version you see in museums with clean dioramas and polite explanations, but the real thing. The smoke-filled shelters, the gnawing hunger, the psychological weight of darkness that never seems to end, and the brilliant, desperate innovations that kept our ancestors alive when everything in nature was trying to kill them. So settle in. Let the world around you fade, because we're about to step into a time when night wasn't just the absence of day. It was a test of everything that makes us human. Let's start with the landscape itself, because understanding the Ice Age night means first understanding the world it descended upon. This wasn't the Earth, you know. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 26,000 to 19,000 years ago, ice sheets 2 miles thick covered vast portions of North America, Europe, and Asia. But it wasn't the ice itself that made nights so deadly. It was what the ice did to everything else. The glaciers locked up so much water that sea levels dropped by 400 feet. Entire continental shelves lay exposed, creating land bridges between continents. The Bering Land Bridge connected Asia to North America. Britain was attached to mainland Europe. Indonesia formed a continuous landmass with Southeast Asia. The world was larger, stranger, and infinitely more connected than it is today. But with all that water trapped in ice, the climate became brutally dry. The air held almost no moisture. This meant that clouds were rare, and when night fell, there was nothing to trap the day's meager heat. Temperatures could drop 40 or 50 degrees in a matter of hours. The ground radiated cold like a living thing, sucking warmth from anything that touched it. The landscape itself was alien. Imagine vast grasslands stretching to every horizon, not the lush prairies of today, but a sparse, hardy vegetation called mammoth steppe. Tough grasses, sedges, and herbs that could survive months of darkness and temperatures that would kill modern plants within days. These grasslands supported enormous herds of megafauna, woolly mammoths with dense underwool, woolly rhinoceroses, steppe bison, prehistoric horses, reindeer, cave bears, and even the now extinct Eurasian cave lions, cold-adapted giants built for a world of endless winter. But when night fell, this world transformed. The animals that humans depended on for food became invisible, dangerous, unpredictable. Predators, cave lions, short-faced bears, dire wolves, emerged from their dens, their eyes adapted to darkness in ways human eyes could never match. The temperature plummeted so fast that exposed skin could develop frostbite in minutes. And the darkness itself was absolute in a way that modern humans, surrounded by light pollution, can barely comprehend. There were no streetlights, no distant glow of cities, no moon bright enough to read by. On a cloudy night, you literally could not see your hand in front of your face. The darkness was so complete that it felt physical, like a weight pressing down on you, suffocating and endless. And yet, in this darkness, humans found ways to survive. They didn't just huddle in caves waiting for dawn. They created light, warmth, and safety in a world that offered none of these things naturally. They transformed the night from an enemy into something they could, if not control, at least negotiate with. The key to understanding Ice Age nights is recognizing that they weren't uniform. Near the equator, even during the Ice Age, nights remained relatively short, perhaps 12 hours at most. But as you moved toward the poles, where many human populations lived, the nights grew longer and longer. In what is now northern Europe or Siberia, winter nights could stretch for 20 hours or more. And in the far north near the Arctic Circle, the sun might not rise at all for weeks or even months. This created a psychological challenge as profound as the physical one. Humans are diurnal creatures, evolved to be active during the day and rest at night. But Ice Age nights were so long that sleeping through them was impossible. People had to find ways to remain active, engaged, and sane during hours and hours of darkness, cold, and confinement. The wind was another factor that made nights particularly deadly. During the day, the sun, weak as it was, provided some warmth and created air currents that moved in predictable patterns. But at night, the temperature differential between the frozen ground and the slightly warmer air above created fierce, unpredictable winds that could strip away body heat in seconds. These weren't gentle breezes. They were howling gales that could knock a person off their feet, that carried ice crystals sharp enough to cut exposed skin, that made any journey outside a shelter potentially fatal. The ground itself became treacherous at night. During the day, the surface might thaw slightly, creating a thin layer of mud or slush. But at night, this froze solid, creating a surface as hard and slippery as glass. Walking became dangerous. Running was nearly impossible. And if you fell, the impact on the frozen ground could break bones. Even the air was different at night. The extreme cold caused the atmosphere to contract, creating a strange, muffled quality to sound. Voices didn't carry as far. The normal sounds of the landscape, wind, animal calls, the crack of ice, became distorted, making it difficult to judge distances or directions. This acoustic distortion added to the disorientation and danger of moving around after dark. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Ice Age nights was the silence. Modern nights are filled with sound, traffic, machinery, the hum of electricity, the distant sounds of other humans. Ice Age nights, especially in winter, were profoundly quiet. Animals were mostly inactive. The wind might howl, but between gusts there was a silence so complete it felt oppressive. In this silence, every sound became magnified, every crack or rustle a potential threat. This was the world that descended every evening. This was the challenge that humans faced not once, not occasionally, but every single night for thousands of years. And somehow, they not only survived it, they mastered it. Now let's talk about shelter, because this is where human ingenuity truly shines. When you think of Ice Age housing, you probably picture crude caves with people huddling around fires. But the reality was far more sophisticated. Ice Age humans were master architects who understood principles of insulation, heat retention, and structural engineering that wouldn't be rediscovered until modern times. The most famous Ice Age structures are the mammoth bone houses of Eastern Europe, particularly in what is now Ukraine and Russia. These weren't simple huts. They were engineered buildings designed specifically for surviving long, dark nights in the coldest climate on Earth. The construction began with excavation. Builders would dig a circular pit, typically 3 to 4 feet deep and 15 to 20 feet in diameter. This wasn't random. The depth was carefully calculated to get below the frost line, where the Earth's natural insulation would help maintain a more stable temperature. The excavated earth was piled around the perimeter, creating a berm that provided additional wind protection and thermal mass. The framework was constructed from mammoth bones, skulls, long bones, tusks, and ribs, arranged in a dome shape. A single house might use the bones of 30 to 40 mammoths, representing tons of material that had to be collected, transported, and carefully positioned. The bones weren't just stacked randomly. They were interlocked in complex patterns that distributed weight evenly and created a structure strong enough to support the heavy covering that would go on top. That covering was a masterpiece of layered insulation. The innermost layer was typically animal hides, reindeer, horse, or mammoth, with the fur side facing inward to trap warm air. Over this went a layer of moss, grass, or other plant material, which provided additional insulation and helped wick moisture away from the interior. The outermost layer was more hides, or, in some cases, a thick layer of turf, which provided weather protection and additional thermal mass. But here's where it gets really clever. The structure wasn't sealed. Small gaps were deliberately left at the top and sides to allow smoke to escape and fresh air to enter. Ice Age architects understood something that wouldn't be formally recognized until centuries later, that proper ventilation was essential for survival. Without it, smoke from fires would accumulate, carbon monoxide would build up, and the occupants would suffocate. The entrance was another marvel of design. Rather than a simple door, most Ice Age structures had a long, low tunnel entrance, sometimes 10 or 15 feet long. This served multiple purposes. It prevented wind from blowing directly into the living space. It created an airlock effect, trapping cold air in the tunnel while keeping warm air inside. And it forced anyone entering to crawl, which meant they couldn't bring weapons in quickly, a security feature that protected against both human and animal intruders. Inside, the layout was carefully organized. The center of the structure was dominated by a hearth, not just a simple fire pit but an engineered heating system. Stones were arranged around and under the fire to absorb and radiate heat long after the flames died down. Some hearths show evidence of clay linings, which improved heat retention and prevented the fire from spreading to the surrounding materials. Around the hearth, the floor was covered with layers of organic material, grass, moss, small branches, creating a soft, insulating surface that kept people off the cold ground. Sleeping areas were typically raised platforms built along the walls, further elevating people from the coldest air, which settled near the floor. Storage areas were built into the structure, often in small alcoves or pits dug into the walls. These weren't just for convenience. They were carefully positioned to take advantage of temperature gradients within the structure. Items that needed to stay frozen were stored near the entrance or in pits that extended below the frost line. Items that needed to stay dry were stored higher up, away from ground moisture. Lighting was a constant challenge during the long nights. The central fire provided some light, but it wasn't enough to illuminate the entire interior. Ice Age people developed sophisticated oil lamps, shallow stone bowls filled with animal fat, with a wick made from moss or twisted plant fibers. These lamps provided steady, smokeless light for hours, and multiple lamps could be positioned around the interior to create a surprisingly well-lit space. But mammoth bone houses weren't the only type of Ice Age shelter. In areas where large bones weren't available, people built structures from wood, stone, or even ice. In Siberia, archaeologists have found evidence of semi-subterranean houses built into hillsides, with wooden frameworks and thick turf roofs. In what is now France and Spain, people modified natural caves, building walls and partitions to create separate living spaces and improve heat retention. Some of the most ingenious shelters were temporary structures built for hunting expeditions or seasonal migrations. These were lightweight, portable designs that could be erected quickly but still provided adequate protection for a night or two. The framework might be made from branches or antlers covered with hides that could be rolled up and carried. These structures show that Ice Age people understood the principle of modular design, creating components that could be easily transported and assembled in different configurations depending on the situation. The maintenance of these shelters was a constant task. Hides had to be checked and repaired regularly, as the extreme temperature fluctuations caused them to crack and deteriorate. The hearth had to be cleaned of ash and rebuilt periodically. The entrance tunnel had to be kept clear of snow and ice, and the entire structure had to be monitored for damage from wind, snow load, or animal intrusion. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of Ice Age architecture was its adaptability. These weren't permanent structures in the modern sense. They were designed to be modified, expanded, or even relocated as needs changed. A family that grew larger could add an extension. A structure that proved too cold could be reinforced with additional layers. And if a location proved unsuitable, the valuable components, bones, hides, tools, could be salvaged and used to build elsewhere. The social organization required to build these structures was also significant. A mammoth bone house couldn't be built by one person or even one family. It required coordinated effort from multiple people, working together over days or weeks. This created social bonds and obligations that extended beyond the immediate family, building the networks of cooperation that were essential for survival. And every night, when darkness fell and the temperature plummeted, these structures became more than just buildings. They became islands of warmth, light, and safety in a hostile world. They were the difference between life and death, between human civilization and extinction. Let's talk about clothing, because surviving Ice Age nights required more than just shelter. It required transforming the human body into a portable survival system. And Ice Age clothing was far more sophisticated than the crude furs you see in movies. The foundation of Ice Age clothing was understanding layering. Modern outdoor enthusiasts talk about base layers, insulation layers, and shell layers. Ice Age humans invented this system 30,000 years ago. They understood that trapped air was the key to insulation, and that multiple thin layers were more effective than one thick layer. The base layer, worn directly against the skin, was typically made from soft, supple leather or very fine fur. This layer had to be comfortable enough to wear for extended periods, but it also had to wick moisture away from the skin. Sweat was deadly in Ice Age conditions. It would freeze, creating a layer of ice against the skin that would rapidly drain body heat. The base layer prevented this by moving moisture outward to the next layer. The insulation layer was where the real engineering happened. Ice Age people used fur from a variety of animals, each chosen for specific properties. Reindeer fur was prized because each hair is hollow, creating thousands of tiny air pockets that trap heat. Arctic fox fur was valued for its density and softness. Mammoth fur, when available, provided unmatched warmth but was heavy and difficult to work with. But they didn't just use fur as it came off the animal. They processed it, treating it with oils and fats to maintain its flexibility and water resistance. They scraped the hides to an even thickness, ensuring consistent insulation, and they cut and sewed the pieces in ways that maximized warmth while allowing freedom of movement. The sewing itself was a technological marvel. Ice Age needles, made from bone or ivory, were incredibly fine, some as thin as modern sewing needles. The thread was made from sinew, carefully prepared to be strong, flexible, and resistant to the extreme temperature changes. The stitches were tiny and tight, creating seams that were nearly waterproof and prevented heat loss. The outer layer was designed to block wind and shed moisture. This was typically made from the hide of larger animals, bison, horse, or mammoth, treated to be as water-resistant as possible. The hide was often smoked, which not only preserved it but also made it more resistant to moisture. Some outer garments show evidence of being coated with fat or oil, creating a primitive but effective waterproofing. But the real genius was in the details. Hoods were designed to protect the face while allowing peripheral vision. Sleeves were cut to allow full range of motion while still sealing at the wrists. Hems were weighted or tied to prevent them from blowing up in the wind. And every opening, neck, wrists, ankles, could be tightened or loosened to regulate body temperature. Footwear was particularly critical. Ice Age boots were complex, multi-layered constructions. The inner layer was soft fur, worn with the fur side against the foot. The middle layer was insulating material, grass, moss, or shredded bark, that could be removed and replaced if it got wet. The outer layer was tough leather, often with the hair left on for additional traction on ice and snow. The soles were especially ingenious. Some boots had wooden or bone inserts that provided insulation from the frozen ground. Others had textured surfaces, carved patterns or attached pieces of hide that improved grip on ice. And the boots were designed to be loose enough to allow for thick wrappings around the feet, but secure enough that they wouldn't fall off during activity. Hand protection was another challenge. Mittens were preferred over gloves because they allowed the fingers to share warmth. But Ice Age mittens weren't simple bags. They were carefully shaped to allow some dexterity while maximizing warmth. Some had separate compartments for the thumb and fingers, creating a hybrid between a glove and a mitten. Others had flaps that could be opened to expose the fingers for detailed work, then closed again for warmth. Headwear was crucial because the human body loses a significant amount of heat through the head. Ice Age people wore close-fitting caps made from fur or leather, often with ear flaps that could be tied under the chin. Some caps had face masks attached, protecting the cheeks and nose from frostbite. And in the most extreme conditions, people would wrap their entire head and face, leaving only a small opening for the eyes. But clothing wasn't static. It had to be adjusted constantly based on activity level and temperature. Working hard and generating heat? Remove a layer or open some closures to prevent sweating. Sitting still on watch? Add layers and seal every opening. This constant adjustment required awareness and discipline, but it was essential for survival. The maintenance of clothing was a never-ending task. Hides had to be cleaned, treated with oils to prevent cracking, and checked for damage. Seams had to be inspected and repaired. Fur had to be brushed to maintain its loft and insulating properties. This wasn't just busy work. It was survival maintenance, as critical as maintaining weapons or tools. Ice Age people also understood the importance of keeping clothing dry. Wet fur or leather loses most of its insulating value and can actually conduct heat away from the body. So they developed techniques for drying clothes even in freezing conditions. Garments were hung near fires, but not too close. Scorched leather is useless. They were beaten to remove ice crystals. They were even buried in dry snow, which would absorb moisture from the fabric. And here's something that often gets overlooked. Ice Age people understood that staying warm wasn't just about physical insulation. They knew that eating high-calorie foods before going out in the cold would help maintain body temperature. They knew that staying active generated heat, but that too much activity would cause dangerous sweating. They knew that alcohol, despite making you feel warm, actually increased heat loss and was dangerous in extreme cold. This knowledge wasn't written in books. It was passed down through generations, taught by parents to children, shared among communities, and refined through the harsh consequences of getting it wrong. Because in the Ice Age, a mistake in cold weather clothing wasn't just uncomfortable, it was fatal. Now we need to talk about fire, because fire was the technology that made everything else possible. Without fire, humans couldn't have survived a single Ice Age night. But maintaining fire in extreme cold, with limited fuel through hours of darkness, was one of the greatest challenges our ancestors faced. The first challenge was fuel. In many Ice Age environments, wood was scarce or non-existent. The mammoth steppe was largely treeless, with only scattered shrubs and dwarf willows. So Ice Age people had to get creative. They burned bone, mammoth bones in particular, which were large, dense, and burned slowly. They burned dried dung from herbivores, which was abundant and, when properly dried, made excellent fuel. They burned animal fat, which provided intense heat, but required careful management to prevent dangerous flare-ups. But the real challenge was keeping fire alive through the night. Starting a fire from scratch was difficult and time-consuming, requiring either friction methods, spinning a stick against a board until the friction created an ember, or percussion methods, striking flint against pyrite to create sparks. Both techniques required skill, dry materials, and considerable effort. So once a fire was started, it was never allowed to go out completely. The technique was called banking the fire. Before sleeping, someone would carefully arrange the coals, covering them with a layer of ash to slow the burning. The ash acted as insulation, keeping the coals hot, but preventing them from consuming all the fuel. In the morning, the ash could be brushed away, fresh fuel added, and the fire would spring back to life. A properly banked fire could stay alive for 12 to 18 hours with no attention. But banking required skill and experience. Too much ash and the coals would suffocate. Too little, and they would burn out. The fuel had to be arranged just right, large pieces that would burn slowly, positioned to allow just enough air circulation. And someone had to check the fire periodically through the night, adding fuel if needed, adjusting the ash covering, ensuring that the precious flame didn't die. The hearth itself was carefully designed to maximize efficiency. Stones were arranged to reflect heat into the living space and to create a draft that pulled air through the fire, improving combustion. Some hearths had clay linings that absorbed heat during the day and radiated it back at night. Others had channels that directed smoke toward the exit while keeping heat inside. But fire provided more than just warmth. It provided light, which was psychologically crucial during the long, dark nights. The flickering flames created shadows that danced on the walls, providing visual stimulation and a sense of life and movement. The light allowed people to see each other's faces, to maintain eye contact, to read expressions, all essential for social bonding and mental health. Fire also provided protection. Most predators feared fire and would avoid areas where flames were visible. The light from a fire extended the safe zone around a shelter, creating a perimeter that animals were reluctant to cross. And the smoke from a fire could be used to signal to other humans, to mark territory, or to communicate across distances. Cooking was another critical function of fire. Raw meat is difficult to digest and can carry parasites. Cooked meat is easier to digest, provides more usable calories, and is safer to eat. But cooking also transformed tough, fibrous plant materials into edible food, expanded the range of foods that could be consumed, and made stored foods more palatable. The social aspects of fire were equally important. The hearth became the center of community life. People gathered around it to eat, to talk, to work on crafts, to tell stories. The fire created a shared space, a focal point that brought people together and reinforced social bonds. In the long, dark nights, this social connection was as important for survival as the physical warmth the fire provided. But fire was also dangerous. In a shelter made from hides, bones, and organic materials, an uncontrolled fire could be catastrophic. Ice Age people developed strict protocols for fire safety. Children were taught from an early age to respect fire, to never leave it unattended, to always maintain a safe distance. Adults took turns watching the fire through the night, ensuring that sparks didn't escape, that the flames didn't grow too large, that the structure remained safe. The smoke from fires was both a blessing and a curse. It helped preserve food, kept insects away, and provided some protection against respiratory infections. But it also irritated eyes and lungs, and in poorly ventilated shelters could build up to dangerous levels. Ice Age architects had to balance the need for heat retention with the need for adequate ventilation, a challenge that required careful design and constant adjustment. Different types of fires were used for different purposes. A large, hot fire was used for cooking and for providing maximum warmth during the coldest parts of the night. A smaller, smokier fire was used for preserving meat or hides. A very small, carefully controlled fire was used for light without generating excessive heat. Ice Age people understood these distinctions and could build and maintain the appropriate type of fire for any situation. The psychological importance of fire cannot be overstated. In the absolute darkness of an Ice Age night, the fire was more than a tool. It was a symbol of human control over nature, a defiant statement that humans could create light and warmth, even in the coldest, darkest conditions. The fire represented hope, safety, and the continuation of life. As long as the fire burned, humans could survive. Let's talk about food, because surviving Ice Age nights required enormous amounts of calories. The human body burns energy constantly to maintain its core temperature, and in extreme cold, that energy expenditure skyrockets. Ice Age people needed to consume between 4,000 and 6,000 calories per day, roughly double what a modern sedentary person needs. The diet was built around fat. Not lean protein, not carbohydrates, but pure, dense fat. Fat provides 9 calories per gram, compared to 4 for protein or carbohydrates. It burns slowly, providing sustained energy and heat production over many hours. And it was essential for maintaining body temperature during the long, cold nights. The primary source of fat was large game animals. A single mammoth could provide thousands of pounds of meat and fat, enough to feed a community for weeks or even months. But mammoths weren't easy to hunt, and they weren't always available. So Ice Age people also hunted horses, bison, reindeer, and other large herbivores, each providing substantial amounts of fat and protein. But they didn't just eat the muscle meat. They consumed every part of the animal: organs, bone marrow, brain, tongue, even the contents of the stomach. Organ meats are incredibly nutrient-dense, providing vitamins and minerals that aren't found in muscle tissue. Bone marrow is almost pure fat, providing massive amounts of calories in a small package. And the partially digested plant material in an herbivore's stomach provided vitamins and fiber that were otherwise difficult to obtain. The preparation of meat was sophisticated. Fresh meat was consumed immediately after a kill, providing maximum nutrition and flavor, but most meat had to be preserved for later consumption. Ice Age people developed multiple preservation techniques, each suited to different conditions and storage durations. Freezing was the simplest method. In winter, meat could be hung outside and would freeze solid within hours, remaining edible for months. But freezing only worked in winter, and it required protection from scavengers. So meat was often stored in pits, dug into the permafrost, creating natural freezers that maintained a constant temperature year-round. Drying was another common preservation method. Thin strips of meat were hung in the cold, dry air, where they would lose moisture and become hard and leathery. Dried meat was lightweight, easy to transport, and could be stored for years. It could be eaten as is or rehydrated in water or broth. Smoking combined drying with the preservative effects of smoke. Meat was hung over a smoky fire for days or weeks, absorbing compounds that inhibited bacterial growth while also drying out. Smoked meat had a distinctive flavor and could be stored for extended periods. Fermentation was a more advanced technique. Meat was buried in the ground or stored in sealed containers, where naturally occurring bacteria would break down the proteins and fats, creating a product that was both preserved and more digestible. Fermented meat had a strong smell and taste, but it was incredibly nutritious and could be stored for months. Fat was preserved separately, often rendered into tallow or lard. Animal fat was melted down, strained to remove impurities, and stored in containers made from stomach or bladder. This rendered fat could be eaten directly, used for cooking, or mixed with dried meat to create pemmican, a high-calorie survival food that could last for years. But Ice Age people didn't live on meat alone. They also consumed plant foods when available. Roots and tubers could be dug from the frozen ground, providing carbohydrates and fiber. Nuts and seeds, when available, provided additional calories and nutrients. Berries could be dried or preserved in fat, creating a sweet treat that also provided vitamin C. The timing of meals was strategic. A large meal was consumed in the evening, before the coldest part of the night. This provided the calories needed to maintain body temperature through the long hours of darkness. The process of digestion itself generated heat, helping to keep people warm, and a full stomach provided a psychological sense of security and comfort. But food wasn't just about nutrition, it was also about social bonding. Meals were communal events, times when the entire group gathered around the fire to share food and stories. The act of sharing food reinforced social bonds, created obligations of reciprocity, and maintained the cooperation that was essential for survival. The distribution of food was carefully managed. The best cuts of meat went to the hunters who made the kill, but everyone received a share. Children, pregnant women, and the elderly received extra portions, recognizing their special nutritional needs. And no one was allowed to go hungry as long as food was available. Starvation was a community failure, not an individual one. Food storage was a constant concern. Preserved food had to be protected from scavengers, both animal and human. Storage areas were carefully guarded, and theft of food was one of the most serious crimes in Ice Age society. The loss of stored food could mean starvation for an entire community, so food security was taken very seriously. The preparation of food was also a social activity. Women typically did most of the food processing, butchering, preserving, cooking, but men also participated, especially in tasks that required strength or specialized knowledge. Children learned food preparation skills from an early age, ensuring that knowledge was passed down through generations. Cooking techniques were surprisingly varied. Meat could be roasted directly over the fire, boiled in water heated with hot stones, or baked in pits lined with hot coals. Different techniques produced different flavors and textures, and Ice Age people understood how to use each method to best advantage. Bone broth was a staple food. Bones were simmered for hours or even days, extracting every bit of nutrition: collagen, minerals, fat, and flavor. The resulting broth was rich, nourishing, and warming, perfect for cold nights. It could be drunk as is or used as a base for cooking other foods. The psychological importance of food extended beyond mere nutrition. A good meal provided comfort, pleasure, and a sense of normalcy in an otherwise harsh existence. The flavors, textures, and aromas of food engage the senses, providing stimulation and enjoyment. And the act of eating together reinforced the social bonds that held communities together. Now, we need to address something that doesn't get enough attention: the psychological challenge of Ice Age nights. Modern humans struggle with seasonal affective disorder after just a few months of shortened daylight. Imagine facing nights that lasted 18 to 20 hours, day after day, for months on end. The psychological toll was immense, and Ice Age people developed sophisticated strategies to maintain mental health in the face of overwhelming darkness. The first strategy was structure. Even when there was no sun to mark the passage of time, Ice Age communities maintained strict routines. People woke at roughly the same time, ate at the same time, worked at the same time, and slept at the same time. This regularity provided a sense of normalcy and control in an environment that could otherwise feel chaotic and disorienting. But structure alone wasn't enough. Ice Age people also understood the importance of light for mental health. The central fire was never allowed to go out completely, providing a constant source of light even during the darkest hours. Oil lamps were used generously despite the cost in fuel, because the psychological benefits of light were worth the expense. Social interaction was another crucial element. The long nights were filled with communal activities: storytelling, music, games, and crafts. These weren't just entertainment. They were deliberate strategies to maintain social bonds and prevent the isolation that could lead to depression and anxiety. Storytelling played a particularly important role. The oral traditions of Ice Age people, passed down through countless generations, were recited during the long winter nights. These stories served multiple purposes. They preserved cultural knowledge and history. They provided entertainment and distraction. and they created a shared experience that reinforced community identity and gave people a sense of connection to something larger than themselves. Music was equally important. Ice Age people created instruments from bone, wood, and hide, flutes, drums, rattles. Music has a powerful effect on mood and emotion, and Ice Age people understood this intuitively. Songs could lift spirits, express emotions, and create a sense of unity among listeners. The act of making music together was a form of social bonding that helped people endure the long, dark nights. Games provided mental stimulation and friendly competition. Archaeological evidence shows that Ice Age people played various games, some involving strategy and skill, others based on chance. These games kept minds sharp and provided a sense of challenge and achievement during months when outdoor activities were limited. Crafts and handiwork also played a role. People carved bone and ivory, created beadwork, wove baskets, and made tools. These activities provided a sense of productivity and accomplishment, countering the feelings of helplessness that could arise from being trapped indoors by the weather. The act of creating something beautiful or useful was psychologically rewarding and helped maintain a sense of purpose. Physical activity was important for mental health even during the coldest nights. People would engage in indoor exercises, stretching, dancing, wrestling, to maintain fitness and generate body heat. These activities also released endorphins, improving mood and reducing stress, but Ice Age people also recognized the importance of solitude and quiet reflection. Not every moment had to be filled with activity. Time was set aside for meditation, prayer, or simply sitting quietly by the fire. This balance between social interaction and solitude was essential for maintaining mental equilibrium. Sleep patterns were different from modern norms. Rather than sleeping in one long block, Ice Age people practiced segmented sleep, sleeping for a few hours, waking for a period of quiet activity, then sleeping again. This pattern, which seems strange to modern people, was actually well suited to the long winter nights, and may have helped prevent the oversleeping and lethargy that can accompany seasonal depression. Diet also played a role in mental health. The high-fat diet provided the calories needed for brain function, and the omega-3 fatty acids from fish and game were important for mood regulation. Ice Age people also consumed fermented foods, which supported gut health, and there's growing evidence that gut health is closely linked to mental health. The community provided support for those who struggled. Mental health issues weren't stigmatized. If someone was suffering from what we might call depression or anxiety, the community rallied around them, providing support, companionship, and practical help. This social safety net was crucial for maintaining the mental health of the entire community. Ice Age people also had spiritual practices that helped them cope with the darkness. Rituals and ceremonies marked the passage of time, celebrated important events, and provided a sense of connection to the divine or the natural world. These practices gave meaning to suffering and helped people maintain hope during the darkest times. The attitude toward darkness itself was important. Ice Age people didn't see darkness as something to be feared or fought against. They saw it as a natural part of the cycle of life, a time for rest, reflection, and preparation for the coming light. This acceptance, this refusal to fight against the inevitable, may have been their greatest psychological strength. Children were taught from an early age to be resilient, to endure discomfort without complaint, to find strength in adversity. This wasn't cruelty. It was preparation for a life where mental resilience could mean the difference between survival and death. The stories, songs, and teachings all reinforced the message that humans could endure anything if they remained strong, stayed together, and never gave up hope. Let's shift our focus to the tools and technologies that made survival possible. Ice Age people weren't primitive. They were sophisticated engineers who developed technologies that were perfectly adapted to their environment. And many of these technologies were specifically designed for use during the long, dark nights. The most basic tool was the hand axe, a stone tool that could be used for cutting, chopping, scraping, and pounding. But Ice Age hand axes weren't crude rocks. They were carefully shaped, with sharp edges and balanced weight distribution. The best hand axes were made from flint or obsidian, materials that could be worked to create edges sharper than modern steel. But hand axes were just the beginning. Ice Age people developed specialized tools for every task. Scrapers for processing hides, burins for carving bone and antler, awls for punching holes in leather, needles for sewing. Each tool was designed for a specific purpose, and the quality of craftsmanship was remarkable. The creation of these tools required deep knowledge of materials and techniques. Stone knapping, the art of shaping stone by striking it with another stone or antler, was a skill that took years to master. A skilled knapper could look at a piece of raw stone and see the tool hidden inside, then remove flakes with precision to reveal it. But stone wasn't the only material. Bone and antler were used extensively, especially for tools that needed to be strong but not necessarily sharp. Bone needles, awls, and points were common. Antler was used for pressure flakers, tools used to remove tiny flakes from stone, allowing for very fine shaping. Wood was used when available, though it rarely survives in the archaeological record. Wooden handles for stone tools, wooden spears, wooden bowls and containers, all were essential parts of the Ice Age toolkit. The wood was carefully selected, shaped, and treated to maximize its strength and durability. Cordage, rope, and string was another critical technology. Made from plant fibers, animal sinew, or strips of hide, cordage was used for everything from sewing to binding tools to creating nets and snares. The creation of cordage required processing raw materials, twisting or braiding them into strong, flexible strands, and treating them to prevent rot and deterioration. Containers were essential for storing food, water, and other materials. Ice Age people made containers from a variety of materials: hide bags, woven baskets, carved wooden bowls, even containers made from stomach or bladder. Each type of container had its advantages and was used for specific purposes. Weapons were, of course, critical for hunting and defense. Spears were the primary weapon, with stone or bone points hafted onto wooden shafts. But Ice Age people also developed spear throwers, devices that extended the arm and allowed spears to be thrown with much greater force and accuracy. Some groups also used bows and arrows, though these were less common in the coldest regions. Traps and snares were used extensively. These allowed people to catch game without constant active hunting, freeing up time for other activities. Traps ranged from simple snares made from cordage to complex deadfalls that could kill large animals. The design and placement of traps required detailed knowledge of animal behavior and movement patterns. But perhaps the most important technology for surviving Ice Age nights was the oil lamp. These simple devices, typically a shallow stone bowl filled with animal fat, with a wick made from moss or plant fibers, provided steady, reliable light for hours. Multiple lamps could be positioned around a shelter, creating a surprisingly well-lit interior, even during the darkest nights. The design of oil lamps was more sophisticated than it might appear. The bowl had to be the right shape to hold the fat while allowing the wick to draw it up efficiently. The wick had to be made from materials that would burn steadily without producing excessive smoke, and the lamp had to be positioned carefully to provide light without being a fire hazard. Ice Age people also developed techniques for creating portable light. Torches made from resinous wood or bundles of dried grass soaked in fat could be carried outside, providing light for nighttime activities. These torches didn't last long, but they were essential for tasks that had to be done after dark, checking on animals, gathering firewood, or responding to emergencies. The maintenance of tools was a constant activity. Stone tools had to be resharpened regularly. Wooden handles had to be checked for cracks and replaced when necessary. Cordage had to be inspected for wear and repaired or replaced. This maintenance wasn't just about keeping tools functional, it was about ensuring survival. A broken tool at a critical moment could be fatal. Tool making was also a social activity. Skilled craftspeople would teach others, passing down techniques and knowledge. The creation of a particularly fine tool was a source of pride and could enhance a person's status within the community, and the sharing of tools reinforced social bonds and created networks of obligation and reciprocity. Innovation was constant. Ice Age people were always experimenting, trying new materials, new designs, new techniques. Not every experiment succeeded, but the ones that did were quickly adopted and spread through trade and cultural exchange. This constant innovation was one of the keys to human survival and success during the Ice Age. Now let's talk about something that might surprise you. Ice Age nights weren't just about survival. They were economically productive. The long hours of darkness when outdoor work was impossible became prime time for craft production, tool making, and other activities that created value and supported trade. Winter nights were when most clothing was made. The processing of hides, scraping, softening, cutting, and sewing, was time-consuming work that required good light and steady hands. The long nights provided the time needed for this work, and the light from fires and oil lamps was adequate for the task. The creation of tools and weapons also happened primarily during the winter months. Stone knapping could be done indoors, and the long nights provided hours for this detailed work. A skilled knapper could produce dozens of tools during a single winter, creating a surplus that could be traded in the spring and summer. Artistic production also flourished during the winter nights. The famous cave paintings of Europe were likely created during winter, when people had time for such activities. Carved figurines, decorated tools, and beadwork were all produced during the long, dark months. These weren't just decorative items, they had economic value and could be traded for food, materials, or other goods. Food processing was another major winter activity. Meat had to be butchered, preserved, and stored. Hides had to be processed. Bones had to be broken open for marrow and then saved for later use as tools or fuel. All of this work happened during the winter months, when fresh kills were most common, and the cold helped preserve the meat during processing. The production of cordage, baskets, and containers also happened during winter. These items were essential for daily life and also had trade value. A well-made basket or a strong length of rope could be traded for food, tools, or other necessities. But the winter economy wasn't just about production. It was also about planning and negotiation. The long nights provided time for discussions about the coming year. Hunting strategies were debated. Trading expeditions were planned. Marriages were arranged. These discussions and negotiations were crucial for the functioning of Ice Age society. Trade networks were extensive, even during the Ice Age. Materials and goods moved across vast distances. Shells from the coast found hundreds of miles inland. Flint from specific quarries distributed across entire regions. Artistic styles and techniques spreading from group to group. This trade wasn't just economic. It was also social and cultural, creating connections between distant communities. The exchange of goods created obligations and relationships that extended beyond the immediate transaction. If one group provided food to another during a time of shortage, that created a debt that would need to be repaid. These networks of obligation and reciprocity were essential for survival, providing a safety net when local resources failed. Wealth in Ice Age society wasn't measured in money. Currency didn't exist. Instead, wealth was measured in relationships, obligations, and the ability to mobilize resources when needed. A person who had many trading partners, who had helped others in the past, who had a reputation for generosity and reliability, that person was wealthy, regardless of how many material possessions they had. The distribution of resources within communities was carefully managed. Food and materials were shared, but not equally. Those who contributed more, successful hunters, skilled craftspeople, wise elders, received larger shares. But everyone received enough to survive. The community couldn't afford to let anyone starve, because every person represented knowledge, skills, and labor that the community needed. Leadership roles were often tied to economic management. The person who organized hunts, who managed food stores, who negotiated with other groups, that person had power and influence. But this power came with responsibility. A leader who failed to provide for the community, who hoarded resources, or who made poor decisions could lose their position. The long winter nights also provided time for teaching and learning. Children learned crafts from their parents and other adults. Young hunters learned tracking and hunting techniques. Everyone learned the stories, songs, and traditions that held the community together. This knowledge transfer was essential for maintaining cultural continuity and ensuring that skills weren't lost. We need to talk about the spiritual and mythological dimensions of Ice Age nights, because the way people understood darkness shaped how they survived it. Ice Age people didn't see the night as merely the absence of day. They saw it as a realm with its own powers, spirits, and meanings. The darkness was alive with spirits. Animals, plants, rocks, rivers, everything had a spirit, and these spirits were most active at night. The darkness was when the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds became thin, when humans could communicate with the spirits, when dreams and visions had special power. The night sky was particularly significant. The stars weren't just points of light. They were the spirits of ancestors, the homes of gods, the map of the cosmos. Ice Age people were skilled astronomers, tracking the movements of stars and planets, using them for navigation and for marking the passage of time. The winter night sky, with its long hours of darkness, provided ample opportunity for celestial observation. The moon was especially important. Its phases marked the passage of time, and its light provided some illumination during the darkest nights. Many Ice Age rituals and ceremonies were timed to the phases of the moon, and lunar cycles were used to track seasons and plan activities. But the night also held dangers. Malevolent spirits were believed to roam in the darkness, and certain precautions had to be taken to protect against them. Fires were kept burning not just for warmth and light, but also for spiritual protection. Certain symbols or objects were placed at entrances to keep evil spirits out, and rituals were performed to appease or ward off dangerous supernatural forces. Dreams were taken very seriously. The long nights provided many hours for dreaming, and dreams were seen as messages from the spirit world. A dream about animals might predict a successful hunt. A dream about ancestors might provide guidance or warnings. Dream interpretation was a valued skill, and those who were particularly good at it held positions of respect and influence. Shamans or spiritual leaders played crucial roles in Ice Age communities. These individuals were believed to have special abilities to communicate with the spirit world, to heal the sick, to predict the future, and to guide the community through spiritual challenges. Many shamanic practices involved altered states of consciousness, achieved through fasting, rhythmic drumming, or the use of psychoactive plants that were believed to allow the shaman to travel to the spirit world. The long winter nights were prime time for shamanic activities. The darkness, the isolation, the psychological stress, all of these created conditions conducive to altered states of consciousness. Shamanic ceremonies often lasted through the night, with participants dancing, chanting, and drumming until dawn. Cave art may have had shamanic significance. Many of the painted caves show evidence of being used for rituals, and some researchers believe that the act of creating the art was itself a shamanic practice, a way of communicating with the spirit world or capturing the spiritual essence of the animals depicted. Death and the afterlife were also associated with darkness. The dead were believed to travel to an underworld, a dark realm beneath the earth. Burial practices often involved placing the body in a fetal position, as if preparing for rebirth, and including grave goods, tools, food, ornaments that the deceased would need in the afterlife. But darkness wasn't only associated with death and danger. It was also a time of rest, renewal, and transformation. Just as the earth rested during winter, preparing for the burst of life in spring, humans used the dark months for rest and preparation. The darkness was necessary, a natural part of the cycle of life. Rituals marked the turning points of darkness and light. The winter solstice, the longest night of the year, was a particularly important time. It marked the moment when the days would begin to lengthen again, when the light would start to return. Celebrations and ceremonies marked this turning point, reinforcing hope and the promise of renewal. The stories told during the long nights often had spiritual or moral lessons. They explained the origins of the world, the nature of the gods and spirits, the proper way to live. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were a form of education, teaching people the values and behaviors that would help them survive and thrive. The spiritual understanding of night also provided psychological comfort. The darkness wasn't random or meaningless. It was part of a larger cosmic order. The spirits weren't arbitrary. They could be understood, appeased, or negotiated with. This sense of order and meaning helped people cope with the uncertainty and fear that darkness could bring. Let's talk about health and medicine, because surviving Ice Age nights meant dealing with a range of medical challenges. Ice Age people didn't have modern medicine, but they had developed sophisticated knowledge of healing, injury treatment, and disease prevention. Frostbite was a constant danger during the long, cold nights. Ice Age people understood that frostbite occurred when tissue froze, and they knew the signs: white or grayish skin, numbness, hard texture. Their treatment was remarkably effective: gradual rewarming, never rapid heating, which could cause additional damage. They understood that rubbing frostbitten tissue could cause harm, so they avoided this common mistake. For severe frostbite, they used poultices made from various plants. Archaeological evidence and ethnographic studies of modern hunter-gatherers suggest that plants with anti-inflammatory properties were applied to frostbitten areas to promote healing. Honey, when available, was used to prevent infection. In some cases, they would lance blisters and drain fluid, a procedure that required skill to avoid causing further damage. Hypothermia was another major threat. Ice Age people recognized the signs: shivering, confusion, slurred speech, loss of coordination. Their treatment focused on gradual rewarming, using body heat from other people, warm drinks, and careful placement near fires. They understood that rapid rewarming could be dangerous, causing shock or heart problems. Respiratory illnesses were common during winter, when people were crowded together in poorly ventilated spaces. They used steam inhalation, often with added herbs, to treat congestion and coughs. They made syrups from honey and various plants to soothe sore throats and suppress coughs. Injuries were treated with surprising sophistication. Broken bones were set and splinted. Wounds were cleaned and dressed. Ice Age people understood the importance of keeping wounds clean to prevent infection, though they didn't understand the mechanism. They used various plants with antimicrobial properties, and they understood that some wounds healed better than others. Pain management was another area where Ice Age people showed medical knowledge. They used various plants with analgesic properties. Willow bark, which contains compounds similar to aspirin, was likely used. They also used cold as a pain reliever, applying snow or ice to injuries to reduce swelling and numb pain. Childbirth during the long winter nights presented special challenges. Ice Age communities had experienced midwives who understood the process of labor and delivery. They used various techniques to manage pain and complications, including herbal remedies, massage, and positioning. The warm environment of the shelter was actually beneficial for childbirth, providing a clean, controlled space. But infant mortality was high, particularly during winter. Ice Age people understood that newborns were especially vulnerable to cold and took special precautions. Babies were kept close to their mothers for warmth, often sleeping in the same bed. They were wrapped in soft furs and kept near the fire. And they were breastfed frequently, which provided both nutrition and warmth. The elderly also required special care during winter. Ice Age people recognized that older people were more vulnerable to cold and illness. They were given the warmest spots in the shelter, the best food, and extra attention. This wasn't just compassion. It was recognition of the value of elders' knowledge and experience. Mental health was also addressed. Ice Age people recognized that the long, dark winters could cause psychological distress. Their treatment focused on maintaining social connections, staying active, and ensuring adequate light exposure. The community provided support for those who struggled, and no one was left to suffer alone. Nutrition was understood to be important for health. Ice Age people knew that certain foods prevented certain illnesses, even if they didn't understand the mechanisms. The consumption of organ meats, for example, provided vitamins that prevented deficiency diseases. The high-fat diet provided the calories needed for immune function and healing. Hygiene practices, while different from modern standards, were important for health. Ice Age people bathed when possible, using heated water or snow. They cleaned their living spaces, removing waste and refreshing bedding materials. They understood that cleanliness was related to health, even if they didn't understand germ theory. Isolation of sick individuals was practiced when possible to prevent the spread of contagious diseases. If someone developed symptoms of a serious illness, they might be moved to a separate shelter or to a separate area of the main shelter. This wasn't abandonment. Care was still provided, but contact was limited to reduce transmission. Herbal medicine was extensive. Ice Age people had detailed knowledge of the medicinal properties of local plants. This knowledge was passed down through generations and was constantly refined through observation and experimentation. Different plants were used for different conditions, some for pain, some for infection, some for digestive issues, some for respiratory problems. The spiritual dimension of healing was also important. Shamans or healers often combined physical treatments with spiritual practices, prayers, rituals, ceremonies. This holistic approach addressed both the physical and psychological aspects of illness, and it may have been more effective than purely physical treatments alone. Now let's talk about the social and political structures that held Ice Age communities together during the long, dark nights. Survival in such harsh conditions required cooperation, and cooperation required organization, leadership, and systems for resolving conflicts. Ice Age communities were typically small, perhaps 20 to 50 people, consisting of extended family groups. These weren't random collections of individuals, but carefully structured social units with defined relationships, roles, and obligations. Everyone knew everyone else, and everyone depended on everyone else for survival. Leadership in these communities was based on competence and respect rather than hereditary position. The best hunter, the most skilled craftsperson, the wisest elder, these people naturally assumed leadership roles. But leadership came with responsibilities. Leaders were expected to provide for the community, to make good decisions, and to put the group's needs above their own. Decision-making was typically communal. Important decisions, where to hunt, when to move camp, how to resolve disputes, were discussed by the entire group or by a council of respected individuals. This participatory approach ensured that everyone had a voice and that decisions had broad support. But the long winter nights tested these social structures, confined in close quarters for months. With limited resources and constant stress, tensions could run high. Conflicts over food distribution, personal slights, or romantic entanglements could escalate quickly. Ice Age communities developed sophisticated mechanisms for conflict resolution. Talking was the first approach. Disputes were discussed openly with the entire community present. Each party had a chance to present their perspective, and others could offer opinions or mediation. The goal was to reach a resolution that everyone could accept, maintaining social harmony. If talking didn't work, other mechanisms were available. Compensation could be offered for wrongs. Public shaming could be used for minor offenses. And in extreme cases, individuals could be ostracized or expelled from the community, a severe punishment that could be a death sentence in Ice Age conditions. The distribution of resources was carefully managed to prevent conflicts. Food was shared, but the distribution followed established rules. Successful hunters received the best portions, but everyone received enough to survive. Those who contributed more to the community, through hunting, crafting, or other work, received larger shares, but the differences weren't extreme. Women played important roles in Ice Age communities, though these roles were different from men's. Women typically managed the household, processed food and hides, made clothing, and cared for children. But they also participated in decision-making, and in some communities, women held positions of spiritual or political leadership. Children were valued members of the community. They weren't just future adults. They contributed to the community's survival through their work. Even young children helped with tasks like gathering firewood, processing food, or caring for younger siblings. And they were the future of the community, so their education and well-being were priorities. The elderly were respected for their knowledge and experience. They had survived many winters, had accumulated vast amounts of practical knowledge, and could provide guidance and wisdom. They also played important roles in teaching children and in maintaining cultural traditions through storytelling and ritual. Alliances between communities were important for survival. No single community could be completely self-sufficient, so networks of trade, mutual aid, and intermarriage connected distant groups. These alliances were maintained through regular contact, gift-giving, and the sharing of resources during times of need. The long winter nights were prime time for maintaining these alliances. Visitors from other communities might stay for extended periods, sharing stories, trading goods, and strengthening social bonds. These visits were important social events, providing variety and stimulation during the monotonous winter months. Marriage was an important mechanism for creating and maintaining alliances. Young people often married outside their immediate community, creating kinship ties that connected different groups. These marriages weren't just personal relationships. They were political and economic alliances that benefited both communities. Rituals and ceremonies reinforced social bonds and community identity. Shared participation in rituals created a sense of unity and common purpose. The long winter nights provided ample time for these ceremonies, which often lasted for hours or even days. Justice was swift and communal. There were no courts, no lawyers, no lengthy trials. If someone committed a serious offense, theft, violence, violation of taboos, the community would gather, discuss the matter, and reach a decision. Punishments were designed to restore balance and maintain social harmony, rather than to exact revenge. The concept of property was different from modern notions. Personal items, tools, clothing, ornaments were owned by individuals, but resources like food, shelter, and land were communal. Everyone had a right to what they needed for survival, but no one could hoard resources while others went without. Reputation was everything. In a small community where everyone knew everyone else, your reputation determined your status, your influence, and your access to resources. A reputation for generosity, skill, and reliability was valuable. A reputation for selfishness, incompetence, or dishonesty could be devastating. The social structures that developed during the long Ice Age nights weren't just about survival. They were the foundation of human civilization. The cooperation, the conflict resolution mechanisms, the systems of leadership and decision-making, all of these would be carried forward as humans spread across the globe and built increasingly complex societies. Now we need to talk about how the experience of Ice Age nights shaped human evolution, culture, and psychology in ways that still affect us today. The challenges our ancestors faced during those long, dark, cold nights left marks on our species that persist tens of thousands of years later. The first and most obvious legacy is our adaptability. Humans survived the Ice Age because we could adapt to extreme conditions through culture and technology rather than biological evolution. This adaptability, our ability to solve problems, to innovate, to learn from experience, is one of our defining characteristics as a species. The social bonds that were forged during Ice Age nights also left a lasting legacy. Humans are intensely social creatures, and our need for community, for cooperation, for shared experiences, all of these were reinforced during the Ice Age. The long nights spent together in close quarters, sharing food and stories and warmth, created patterns of social behavior that are still with us. Our psychological responses to darkness also have Ice Age roots. Many people experience anxiety or fear in complete darkness, a response that would have been adaptive during the Ice Age when darkness truly was dangerous. Our preference for light, our tendency to gather around fires or other light sources, our use of light to create feelings of safety and comfort, all of these behaviors echo Ice Age survival strategies. The importance of storytelling in human culture also has Ice Age origins. The long winter nights were prime time for stories, and the oral traditions that developed during this period were the foundation of all later literature, mythology, and cultural transmission. The stories we tell today, in books, movies, around campfires, are descendants of the stories told in Ice Age shelters. Our relationship with fire is another Ice Age legacy. Fire is central to human culture in ways that go beyond its practical uses. We gather around fires for social occasions. We use fire in rituals and ceremonies. We find fire comforting and mesmerizing. This deep connection to fire was forged during the Ice Age, when fire was literally the difference between life and death. The technologies developed during the Ice Age also had lasting impacts. The techniques for working stone, bone, and hide, the methods for preserving food, the designs for clothing and shelter, all of these were refined during the Ice Age and formed the foundation for later technological developments. The Ice Age also shaped human migration patterns. As people developed the technologies and strategies to survive in cold climates, they were able to spread into previously uninhabitable regions. The settlement of Northern Europe, Siberia, and eventually the Americas was made possible by Ice Age survival technologies. The genetic legacy of the Ice Age is also significant. Populations that survived the Ice Age in different regions developed genetic adaptations to their environments. Some of these adaptations, like variations in skin color, body shape, or metabolic efficiency, are still visible in modern populations. The psychological traits that helped people survive Ice Age nights, resilience, patience, the ability to delay gratification, the capacity for hope in difficult circumstances, are still valued in modern societies. These traits weren't just useful during the Ice Age, they're fundamental aspects of human psychology that continue to serve us well. The Ice Age also shaped our aesthetic sensibilities. The art created during this period, cave paintings, carved figurines, decorated tools, shows a sophisticated sense of beauty and symbolism. The human capacity for artistic expression, for creating beauty even in the harshest circumstances, was fully developed during the Ice Age. Our relationship with nature was also shaped by the Ice Age experience. Ice Age people lived in intimate connection with the natural world, dependent on it for survival, but also deeply knowledgeable about it. This relationship, respectful, practical, spiritual, is something that many modern people are trying to recapture. The Ice Age taught humans that survival requires community. No individual could survive alone. Success required cooperation, sharing, and mutual support. This lesson is still relevant today, as we face global challenges that require collective action and cooperation. The Ice Age also demonstrated human resilience. Our ancestors faced conditions that should have been impossible to survive, and not only did they survive, they thrived. They created art, music, and culture. They raised families and built communities. They proved that humans can endure almost anything if we work together and refuse to give up. The long Ice Age nights were a crucible that forged modern humanity. The challenges our ancestors faced, the solutions they developed, the bonds they formed, all of these shaped who we are as a species. We are the descendants of people who survived the impossible, and that legacy of resilience, adaptability, and determination is still with us. So here we are, at the end of our journey through the Ice Age nights. We've explored the frozen landscapes, the ingenious shelters, the sophisticated clothing, the high-calorie diets, the psychological strategies, the tools and technologies, the social structures, and the spiritual beliefs that allowed humans to survive in conditions that would kill most modern people within hours. But the most important lesson isn't about any specific technique or technology. It's about the human spirit, the refusal to give up, the determination to survive, the creativity to find solutions to seemingly impossible problems. Ice Age nights were long, dark, and deadly. The cold was intense enough to kill in minutes. The darkness was absolute and lasted for most of the day. The isolation was profound, and yet humans didn't just endure these conditions, they thrived in them. They created light in the darkness using fire and oil lamps to push back the night. They created warmth in the cold, using layered clothing and engineered shelters to maintain body temperature. They created community in isolation, using stories, music, and shared experiences to maintain social bonds and mental health. They transformed a hostile environment into a home. They turned winter from an enemy into a season of productivity and creativity. They used the long nights for craft production, for storytelling, for teaching and learning, for strengthening the social bonds that held communities together. The Ice Age nights taught humans that survival isn't just about physical toughness. It's about mental resilience, social cooperation, and the ability to find meaning and purpose even in the harshest circumstances. It's about refusing to see yourself as a victim of your environment and instead seeing yourself as someone who can shape that environment to meet your needs. These lessons are still relevant today. We may not face the same physical challenges that Ice Age people did, but we face our own challenges, environmental, social, psychological. And the Ice Age example shows us that humans are capable of extraordinary adaptation when we combine practical innovation with social cooperation and mental toughness. The people who survived the Ice Age nights weren't superhuman. They were ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. They were parents trying to keep their children warm. They were elders sharing knowledge accumulated over lifetimes. They were young people learning the skills they would need to survive. They were communities working together because they understood that survival was a collective effort. They didn't have the advantages we have today. No modern technology, no global supply chains, no emergency services. What they had was each other, their knowledge, their tools, and their determination. And it was enough. Every time you turn on a light in the darkness, you're echoing the Ice Age people who kept their fires burning through the long nights. Every time you put on a warm coat, you're using principles of layered insulation that were developed 30,000 years ago. Every time you gather with friends or family, sharing food and stories, you're participating in a tradition that stretches back to the Ice Age. The Ice Age nights were a test of everything that makes us human: our intelligence, our creativity, our social nature, our resilience, our capacity for hope. And we passed that test, not just barely, not just by the skin of our teeth, but decisively. We didn't just survive, we flourished. The darkness that should have killed us instead taught us to create light. The cold that should have frozen us instead taught us to generate warmth. The isolation that should have broken us instead taught us the value of community. The hardship that should have defeated us instead made us stronger. That's the real story of how humans survived the Ice Age nights. Not through any single innovation or strategy, but through a complete reimagining of what it means to be human in an extreme environment. We didn't just adapt to the Ice Age, we mastered it, and in doing so, we became the species that would eventually spread across the entire planet and reshape the world. And on the coldest, darkest nights, when the wind howls and the darkness presses in, remember the Ice Age, people. Remember that humans have survived far worse than anything most of us will ever face. Remember that we are the descendants of survivors, of innovators, of people who refused to give up no matter how impossible the situation seemed. The Ice Age nights are long gone, but their legacy lives on in us. In our adaptability, our resilience, our social nature, our capacity for innovation, and our refusal to accept defeat. We are the children of the Ice Age, and we carry within us the strength, the creativity, and the determination that allowed our ancestors to survive the longest, darkest, coldest nights in human history. They survived, they thrived, and they left us a legacy that continues to inspire and guide us today. The Ice Age nights were humanity's greatest test, and we passed it with flying colors. And that, more than anything else, is what makes us human.